Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me this morning. I'm really pleased at how many people have joined into this session. It's something I talk about quite a lot in my training, is this idea of checking for understanding. And even though I often work with teachers who are very experienced, and I watch a lot of lessons, I get the privilege of watching a lot of teachers teach. I still find this is an area which is still incredibly, challenging. And if I just show the picture of what's going on in a lesson here. Now, what's going on? There's a lot going on. The teacher's got to think about what to teach, the concepts they're trying to explain, wanting all the students in the class to understand them for themselves. And they might have great resources, good questions, and feel they're being very interactive with how they're talking to the class and getting them thinking. And still, they can't really always know exactly what's going on. And I think there are things that teachers can do to be even more likely to be finding out what's happening in students' heads, and also for more students to be really focused on the learning in hand. But I don't think we should underestimate the challenge. It's actually incredibly complex, this sort of world of multiple students thinking. And I think checking for understanding is a really important idea, because it makes you always question whether or not students have understood, rather than assuming they have. I mean, I've watched quite a lot of teachers teach where the teacher is a bit of a raconteur. They are a storyteller. They're entertaining. I mean, you could watch them all day long, and because they're interesting, but they don't often. Sometimes teachers don't stop to even just see, hang on a minute, I think I'm making sense here. Am I? Are you hearing me? Are you making sense of what I think I'm saying to you? And that simple level of checking, like making sure there's a kind of loop between you and the students, and not just one, but many, I think is a really important thing to do. It links to like nearly anything we talk about. You could link most of what we talk about in school to this book, Why Do Students Like School? It's because, and the reason I think you can link it to it is because Dan Willingham gives us really good explanation for why and how we learn, and why sometimes we don't learn. And in his book, he has this famous chapter. I could just reach over to my shelf and pull it off here. It's a book I keep close to me. Why do students forget everything I say? And he presents this memory model, and it's a simple model. It's obviously a flow diagram. It's not a physical model. It's amazing how sometimes people who shall remain nameless critique simple models of memory as if it's trying to be a complete description of everything that happens in learning. Obviously, it isn't. It's a way of, and there are other models. I mean, you've got this stuff here, which is Oliver Caviglioli's amazing work, looking at visual, spatial sketchpad. We have this way of trying to imagining things, and we also have auditory loops, language-based thinking. And then this comes from Fiorella and Mayer, their SOI model. We have to select ideas, organize them in working memory, and then through doing that, we integrate that with our prior knowledge, and that's essentially a learning process. These are all models which are helpful. And in Dan Willingham's model, which we use in our walkthroughs book, this is the way we represent it. I find this endlessly useful, talking to teachers about it. And if you were sitting in front of me and you were just a group of people in a training session, I would stop talking now and get you to talk through this. What sorts of things does this tell us? And the sorts of things you might cover are the fact that attention isn't something you can assume. When students are sitting in front of you, just because they're looking at you doesn't mean they're thinking what you want them to be thinking. And there are simple techniques of creating attention. So, for example, if I said to you now, can anybody there, like there's 50 odd people, can any one of you tell me the last 8 presidents in the United States? And if I frame it like that, can any one of you tell me, or who thinks they can tell me? Now, thinking of 8 presidents, it's not difficult, but it requires some energy and thought and focus and attention. And you might think, oh no, I'll wait, because what happens in lessons is that eventually, normally the teacher will give the answer and someone will give the answer. So if you wait around long enough, you don't have to think too hard, someone will give you the answer, unless the culture is different and you secure attention by something like, okay, everybody, I want you to make a list of the last 8 American presidents on a bit of paper or in your head, and I'm going to call on you to see randomly, and because it could be anybody, and we're using the technique cold calling, which means I'll select who to answer, that makes you focus your attention. You think, oh no, I might be the one asked, so I better do that job. And you go into your memory and you think, okay, so there was Trump and Obama, and you do the thinking. And it's simply the expectation that you might be asked to give your answer makes you focus your attention. Whereas if you don't think that you might be asked because you can opt out, you don't focus your attention. And little things like that, which you do every lesson, I think create a different expectation and make students work harder in their thinking. So there's lots of things like that. And of course, there's these loops of recall. We have to activate prior knowledge, explore a schema for the idea that we're talking about, and then connect new ideas to that. And if we don't actively give students time to think about what they already know, we can find ourselves talking at students, and they're hearing information which they can't process because they either haven't had time to kind of explore what they knew already, or maybe they didn't even know it. So it's worth looking at the sorts of things. Dan Willingham talks about memory being the residue of thought. He talks about understanding being remembering in disguise. So getting students to explain things, not just do you know it, but can you explain it, that kind of depth. So, I'm sitting here in a room where the radiator is broken, so it's cold. I can explain that. I kind of know it's true, but why? Why do you feel cold? What does feeling cold mean? I could explain that. It's something I could link lots of knowledge together to give an explanation. And that's deeper from just knowing a few separate facts. So when do you give students a chance to explain things rather than just responding to short answers? Storytelling. So, what's the story of this event or that phenomenon? Linking ideas together through stories, and sometimes just drilling for fluency. So knowing stuff that you can quickly do, like when we use language, when we're using maths operations, and certain factual knowledge, which is really useful to just know rather than having to kind of dredge up. And all these things are things that Dan Willingham talks about that help us when we're teaching. So an example like this: why does your heart beat faster during exercise? If you think about what students are thinking about there, and you want every student to understand that, there's so much knowledge to explain. You could be asking that of children who are 7 years old or 11 years old or 15 years old or 18. And at each level, they would have a more and more and more sophisticated set of ideas, which they're increasing the density of their connections. And so understanding something isn't something you can just say, I understand it. It's all about how well you understand it for the sort of stage you are in the learning. And you need to be clear of that as a teacher. We can't just tick a box saying, I understand why your heart beats faster during exercise. It all depends on the depth of knowledge you're expecting the students to use when they are giving that explanation. So we have to revisit things. So understanding something and checking for understanding does require an understanding of the curriculum and the standards linked to that. So why might somebody not understand why their heart beats faster during exercise? Well, it could be attention deficits. It could be while you're explaining it or while a demonstration is happening, they're not focusing. They're not focusing in the right way. They're focusing on the wrong things, and that has left them missing key bits of explanation. They might just have forgotten or never been taught some specific things that you're relying on. I see this in lessons a lot, where the teacher is teaching something as if the students will know it, and they just don't know it. And it's just, they're just looking at me like for help, saying, I don't know what's this all about. And I could give you many examples of that. A famous example I often use in English context is when teachers are talking about Henry VIII and how in England we broke away from the Catholic Church in 1533, and the phrase is that Henry broke away from Rome, the king broke away from Rome. And I've been in lessons where the students didn't know what that meant. They thought Rome was a city in Italy, and the teacher has assumed they knew that Rome meant the center of the Catholic Church, and they didn't know that. So the whole thing was a bit meaning, like how can you break away from a city that you're not even in? And the students are totally confused by this whole thing, and because of the assumption the teacher was making that Rome equals Catholic Church. And that was not something the students that I was talking to knew, and because they were supposed to have been taught that the year before, and other things had gone on. So it's really worth using a simple memory model, an intentionally and usefully simple model, to diagnose reasons why students might not know something. They might have forgotten it through lack of recall and practice. So they may have been taught it in the past and never used it since, so they've forgotten it. It could be that they've done lots of tasks. So this is a classic problem, that they might have books which look like there's stuff in it, but the actual tasks were not a good proxy for learning, which means they were filling in the table, labeling the diagram, copying the paragraph from the board, and it might appear that there's work being done. But actually, if you close the book, the students don't really understand what they were doing because the tasks in themselves didn't make them think hard enough. And that's a real pitfall. So there's lots of reasons why a student might not know something. And so we have to be always thinking, even though I'm working really hard to explain, there's a risk that some of the students here might not have understood. So who are they? And I need to find out. So I've got this sort of constant challenge. Has the message been received? And for me, as a teacher mindset, it's one of the most important things to be thinking, especially if you've been talking for any period of time. I think I've been talking quite a lot now. Right, let me just see, and then selecting students to check. And there are lots of really good ways of checking, which we'll see in a minute. And what Dylan William explains, and this is an epically good book here, which I know a lot of you will be familiar with. I'll just hold it up to the camera here in case you can see that, as well as the presentation. Inside the Black Box. So Dylan William and Paul Black wrote this in 1998, and I've been teaching 11 years by 1998. And when this came into school, we were just cock a hoop. We thought, this is fantastic. There's people out there who know stuff about teaching, and well, let's listen to them. And one of the things that this book made us do is it stopped us grading work and alongside comments, because it made us realize that the students only really see the grade. They don't read the comments. That was one thing. But the other one was, he makes a big play about checking for understanding. And they describe, Paul Black and Dylan William describe the scenario, which is very real, which is that teachers are often in a hurry to get through a lesson. They not in the sense they're rushing through it, but they're worried of covering the curriculum. It's a very common teacher anxiety. I need to cover this material because look at all the stuff we have to teach, and how am I going to manage it? So we want to get through stuff. And so what you do is you just want to do a quick check to see if we're okay. And we ask a few students. Now, what can happen is you ask a few students, and they're the ones that look like they're giving you positive feedback. So we pick them, and they're more likely to respond spontaneously anyway. And it's very, very common in lessons to see that a few students dominate the discourse, and the teacher has to sort of fight against that tide actively to bring other students in. And if they don't, a subset of the group really are the main people talking in a lesson. And that means a lot of the students are not talking in a lesson. And then when the teacher asks them a question, they don't ask them in a deep way. They ask them in a shallow way. So they'll just ask for quick one-word answers, or a quick yes or no, or short responses. And then the totality of that is they capture this well. The teacher, by lowering the level of questions, because they want short answers, and by accepting answers from a few, can keep the lesson going, but they're out of touch with the understanding of most of the class. And this is I see this a lot. So you're teaching the socks off, but because you're only getting a shallow response from the students, you don't really know how most students are thinking. And so we need to do better than that. We need to do better than this grazing a few shallow answers if we're going to be responsive. So the whole point of this is that you need to be able to adapt your teaching so that we can be better. So if you knew that the students that you were talking to were clearly not getting it, you would adjust. You would say, okay, look, most of you aren't getting this. Or quite a few of you haven't understood. Let's go back. Let's look at this again. Let's try it a different way. Let's explain it a different way. Let's have another example. Let's have a look at another example. I'll model another one for you. But you would only do that if you felt that there were enough students who would benefit from that for it to be worth it. If you're basing that decision on the few students who are giving you good answers, you'd be thinking, hey, everyone's good here. This is great. Let's move on. But actually, you could be leaving half the class behind and they weren't ready to move on. And that's not a trivial issue. That's a significant issue if you do that all the time. And that is why students leave school not being able to write, do basic maths, and so on, and know some fundamental things about science and geography because they went through school in half of the class that was left behind all the time. And I really think that's true. I think a lot of children are left behind systematically, lesson after lesson, because the systems don't allow the teacher to notice that at the time until they do a test, and by which time so many other things have been locked in. So we need to have really good responsive teaching, and checking for understanding is the main method for doing that. Now, in Rosenshine's principles, which, as I was said just before we came on this, that is something I talk about a lot. I love this. This is a typed paper that Rosenshine was presenting at a conference, which is, I guess, the ResearchED of its day. And he this is 1982. Checks for understanding. He underlines it, and it's the only thing in that whole paper that is underlined. So it's obviously an important thing. And what he says is, how not to check for understanding is to say, have you understood? And again, it's a classic teacher pitfall. So you're talking to a class and you're saying, I've explained this concept. I've explained how to multiply out those brackets. I've explained why Henry broke away from Rome. I've explained why your heart beats faster using the concept of respiration and cells and so on. Have you understood? Now, if students have got a simple choice to that, they'll either nod at you to appease you, or they'll say no, which is quite rare. Usually they just say, yeah, and they move on, or they don't say anything. It doesn't tell you anything. And sometimes teachers have like almost comically elaborate things of going thumbs up, or, thumbs up if you understood, or halfway if you're not sure. And you've got this literally a class of children sort of doing this at you as if this is going to help you make a choice. I just think it's the most ridiculous thing teachers ever do is thumbs up, thumbs down. Who thinks they've understood? And what do you think that's telling you? Well, in fact, what Rosenshine suggests is you should be saying, and this is the common sense thing, is asking them to tell you what they've understood. So what you've understood. So we need to have a sampling process. We have to say, right, so Isaac, what do you think? What do you think's happening here? What have you understood? And we have ways of sampling the room. And Jessica, you were talking to Naomi there. What were you thinking? How do you think this concept works? And you get students to bring out of themselves their understanding, and you hear them explain their understanding, and then it's just giving you a feel for what's going on. So that's what checking for understanding is about. It's about finding out from students. Now, this is what Rosenshine says in this paper. When they did the study, more effective teachers. He has this sort of, if you know the paper, he has this loose categorization: more effective teachers, less effective teachers. And the more effective teachers frequently checked if students are learning the material. And I think this is important. 2 reasons. If you're asking questions which are a check for understanding, you're making those students that you ask elaborate on that material, and that helps them explore. So you're asking them in a way which says the fact of giving an explanation actually is helping you make those connections. There are lots of phenomena, which I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute, where you think you know them until you have to explain them, and then you suddenly think, oh gosh, do I understand it? Because I thought I knew it, but now I'm trying to explain it. I'm not so sure, and it tells you about yourself. And the second part is making you realize which parts you need to focus on. So until you hear the students sort of relay it back to you in some way, you're not sure which bits they get and don't get. So you hear from them. So that's important. It's a 2-way thing. It benefits you, it benefits the students. By contrast, less effective teachers ask, are there any questions? And if there are no questions, they assume the material had been learned. So it's clearly a poor, it's not a good idea, is it? To just assume that just because students have not answered. And I see this so often. Any questions? No? Excellent. As if that means there weren't any questions. All it means is, okay, none of you are feeling comfortable to express your uncertainty at this moment. That's all it means. And it's really down to you creating that. So asking if there are any questions is often a dead end. How can you check for understanding? Well, Rosenshine gives some helpful things. So simple ideas like asking questions. So if you say to somebody, what's this or what's that, that is a check for understanding in itself. But there are some other ideas, and all of these, I think, go with the strategy which is cold calling, which means I select who answers. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So we're not asking for volunteers to answer questions. We are selecting students to ask the questions. so that we get a spread around the room and there are no sort of no-go areas, and all the students are always thinking it could be them that has to answer. Summarizing the presentation up to that point. How obvious is that? Okay, I've been reading the story. I've read you the story. Right, let me just stop for a second. Mohammed, where are we up to so far? What's been happening so far in the story? And just getting him to summarize what's been happening is a check for understanding. Is he taking it in? What if he can't do it? You think, well, do you know what's going on? You just sat at the sounds just going over your head. Or I'll just explain how to solve these simultaneous equations. And I think I've done a really nice presentation on the board and looks very clear. Does it make sense? Joanna, let's see it. Go through it for us. Summarize the key steps that I've taken. Just getting students to hear. Repeating directions or procedures. So obvious. You're about to do a practical task in art or science or technology. You set some homework. Just getting someone to say, okay, so John, what have I asked you to do for homework? Getting them to tell you. You hear from them, okay, we missed out a bit. So Jessica, which bit did John miss out? And so on. You're hearing the students repeating back to you what they're supposed to do. Agreeing or disagreeing is a good one. So that creates accountability across the class. And I think this is quite useful. So let's say, for example, a student is giving you an answer. They've said, there's a multiple choice question with some maths problems, and they say it's answer C, and you go, okay, that's interesting. Now John is over there. Is he paying attention? Is he understanding? So you say, John, do you agree with that? And he has to, you haven't asked him his answer. He was ready to tell you his answer, but you haven't asked him his answer. You've asked him, do you agree with Susanna's answer? And that's making him check his engagement in the lesson, but also, do you understand why someone might have chosen that? Or it could be a more extended answer, like, in my opinion, she might have said, in my opinion, it's immoral for people to earn more than 50% more than any other living soul or something. John, do you agree with that? So you have to understand what she said and why she might have said it. And he might say, no, I don't agree because, and give a reason. And you're finding out what he understands about this idea. But that accountability for listening comes from whether they agree or disagree with each other. Asking students to think aloud as they work. That can seem a bit contrived, but it's quite useful to say, like, before you go off and write your essay, Isaac, let's hear you. What's your plan for the first paragraph then? What are you thinking you're going to write? So you hear him say, well, I'm thinking this, then I'm thinking that. So before he goes off and does it, maybe poorly, you hear him think through what he would do. Or a maths problem. Don't worry about the answer. Just what's your strategy going to be? What would you do in this problem? How would you approach this? And you asking students to explain their thinking. And then explain or defend. I mean, this is a really simple one. I mean, for example, if someone says the answer to a question is yes or no or answer B or 6.1, you can say something simple like, are you sure? Like, are you sure? And they have to go, and you say, why isn't it B? Why isn't it answer C? You've put B, why isn't it answer C? You've said it goes to the left. Why doesn't it go to the right? So you then have to then reconfirm. No, it doesn't go to the left because it doesn't go to the right. It goes to the left because, and it just giving the students that slight pushback of, are you sure it's the answer? So they haven't just been able to trot out a standard answer, but which they may have borrowed or just remembered off by heart. They have to think why it is. So checking for understanding. Rosenstein is very good in the detail on this. Really simple, powerful stuff. I say powerful because I think it makes a big difference. So checking for understanding during class instruction is really, really useful. And it's something you've got to have in your head, and there's so many little elements to it. So just a few more things. First thing is to get everyone thinking. So if you're checking for understanding across the whole class, you need everybody thinking. So you need to have routines, which are, I need everybody thinking. And cold call is the best way to do that. And in our walkthroughs work, we use these hexagons to sort of link ideas together. We call them a cluster. And for me, these three techniques are a cluster which work well. So cold calling. So I select a student to respond. Pair share, where you talk to your partner and everyone is talking then. Or at least 50% of the class is talking and the others are listening, and this will. And checking for understanding, which is you're finding out. Now, those three techniques to me just make a wonderful set. Checking for understanding then starts with a cold call. It's in our walkthrough for check for understanding. Cold call means I select. So the reason I select is so I don't want volunteers. I need everyone ready to think. So I say, okay, here's the question. The question is, what is bigger, 2/7 or 3/10? What's bigger, 2/7 or 3/10? And that's the question. So everyone's thinking, giving them thinking time. And we're going to try and do it mentally. So you can write it down, but I want you to try and do it in your head. So Susanna, how did you get on? So I asked Susanna, what did you think? What was your method or whatever? So I ask her, and then we have a dialogue. So checking for understanding isn't just lovely answer, thank you, lovely answer, thank you, lovely answer, thank you. No, it's okay, interesting. Why did you choose that method? Why did you think that? Do you always have to turn it into a decimal? Is there an easier way of thinking of it? So we probe, I listen to her, I respond, I engage, we have a short dialogue. And then I've asked someone else. So Susanna's given quite a good account. She thinks she knows that this is the answer. Ibrahim, what about you? And we hear his. Now, often students have different ways of expressing the same idea, even if they're both correct. And it's interesting hearing them explain the priorities, the use of language, and you're going, oh, that's interesting. Is that the same? Is that different? Are they equally valid? And it's just weighing up. One answer on its own can sometimes feel a bit hard to evaluate. Is that a good answer? I don't know, but if I see two answers side by side, I can say, oh, is that better than that one? And that's why having at least two answers to compare is useful for you and for the students. You can hear the quality of, or the depth of thinking. And then we can decide, 2, 3, 4 students. So check for understanding is useful. But still here, I've only maybe had a few students talking, so which is why the pair share is important, because then I can get everybody talking. So let's say I want everyone to rehearse this explanation. So turn to your partner, think for a moment right now, explain your method to your partner. So they're all talking, rehearsing their knowledge. And then you say, right, what were you saying? What were you saying? And they've all had a chance to already think aloud, think to their partner. And this rhythm of paired discussion, then whole class discussion, always hearing students explain, gets into the detail and you finding out what's happening in the rhythm of a lesson. Again, you might think this sounds so obvious, but I go to schools all the time and it doesn't happen all the time. You still see a lot of lessons dominated by a few students, and the questions are shallow. They're not probing. They're not dialogic. They're just, the teacher kind of just wants to get through the material and say, I've explained it to you and now you should know it. And they're going to wait till next week or do a test before they find out if the students understood, rather than in the dynamics of the lesson. Part of the check for understanding steps that we have in walkthroughs is probe with a short dialogue. And it's useful to have some stems for that. So what sorts of things do you say? And Rosenshine is good for this. So he has these sorts of things, how are such and such alike? What is the main idea of? What are the strengths and weaknesses of? And it's useful to develop a repertoire of questions that you use to probe a bit more deeply. And you pick these up through the curriculum and through practice, but it's really good to sort of actively practice a few, and you find that you get into a rhythm of asking more probing questions. And scaffolds for dialogue can be useful. So sometimes students who are less confident, they know what to say, so they'll just say something like, now full sentences, I've just been seeing a discussion on Twitter about this today, like you don't want the students to speak in full sentences like it's the law, but they ought to be able to sort of help them formalize an answer. So if you say, which of these materials is from the set of materials, give me an example of a non-metal, and the student might just say carbon, and that's not wrong, but they're not practicing using the language. So you could say, okay, that's well done. Let's have that in a full sentence, and I'll just say, I think one example of a non-metal is carbon, and that's not how you want them to talk in their life, but it's a way of them linking the idea, linking carbon to non-metal in a verbal way. And it makes them say more than one thing. It sets an expectation that when we have formal discussions, we try to say more than just one word. And it ups the ante. But it isn't saying you must always speak in a full sentence. But it's a useful deepening prompt. And another one, I saw a fantastic lesson where the teacher had written firstly, secondly, and finally on the board of the class. Firstly, secondly, and finally. And in their pair, They had to come up with 3 reasons for a scenario being true, and then had to give their answer by saying firstly this, secondly, and finally, to make them say 3 things, so that they had to think of the 3. And they also had to use the structure firstly, secondly, and finally. And of course, it was a scaffold, it's a device, but it was working really well. And the students were definitely thinking harder than they would have done otherwise. So scaffolding the talk in that way, I think, is really, really useful. So here, this is getting into some of the detail. And another thing is the decision to move on. So this is the crux of it. You have to be responsive. The purpose of checking for understanding, the purpose of it is so that you are ready to go back. So you have to be ready to go back. And I find so many teachers where they're kind of not, they're kind of reluctant. Really, they're thinking, get through it, get through it, get through it. And they sort of almost don't want to know that the students can't do it. And that sounds a bit critical, but literally when you're saying to the students, I saw a teacher, I often cite this example because it was such a classic example. He explained some coding in Python language to making a timer. It had about 8 lines of code, lots of different brackets and commas and colons, which are all quite important. And he just said at the end of the lesson, at the end of his explanation, is everybody okay with that? Yeah, all good? Any questions? No? And the way he said no, it kind of meant don't have any questions. And the students didn't ask him any questions. And of course, when they went off to their computers to do this coding, they were all putting their hand up saying, sir, what's this, what's this? And it was just, it was a nightmare. He didn't stop for a minute to say, right, okay, let me just check. Michael, what's the significance of this bit here? Or Stevie, talk it through for us. What line by line, what happens? What are the main things you've got to watch out for on each line? Something like that. And it's that instinct to check was missing from him. And of course, then he wasted all this time trying to mop up the mess later. And he could have saved a lot of pain by just checking and stopping, rather than assuming that the fact they didn't answer any questions. So that instinct to move on at all costs is a bad one. But sure, if the students are with you and they're getting it, move on, brilliant. But be ready to go back. Or defer means maybe we need to come back to this. Sometimes some confusion is inevitable, and that there's a few other bits to come, and probably we'd be better off doing this again next week, or so that there's been a bit more time for them to process it, and you make that intelligent choice. But you won't know how to make the choice or whether there's a choice to make unless you've done the checking for understanding. So cold calling, check, think, pair, share, check for understanding, and then there are various other spin-off things like process questions, classic kind of a Rosenshine technique where he talks about asking students not just if they've understood, but what they've understood. But how what came up with the answer. That's really important. And probing questions, like going deeper. But why is that, and how could you explain that, and so on. And say it again better is a way of getting students to offer a sort of first answers, a bit like with the full sentences, but sometimes students just use the incorrect terminology. They might just say the graph goes up rather than saying the temperature is increasing, which is what you wanted them to say. And so you want to use the language temperature and increasing, and they say it goes up. So you give them a chance to reframe the answer with the correct terminology, so they're practicing it. So all these techniques come together, and they're part of a repertoire of techniques which hopefully people will sort of weave together. And that's what's happening. They're dealing with these issues. They are dealing with all of those issues. What's happening is you're checking for understanding, you're modeling answers, you're scaffolding responses through the discussion, you're helping them review their material, because in checking, hearing them speak, they're finding out what they know and don't know in order to give the answer. It's a form of practice, because talk is practice. You're using knowledge, you're using language. And if you've broken your curriculum down into small steps so that what you're checking for understanding of is each step, it's easier. So rather than giving everyone an enormous amount of information and then seeing if they've understood, you give them it in chunks, and you say, right, are we understanding that bit? Right, now are we understanding that bit? Right, okay, here's a bit more. Do you understand that? And we check as we go, You're much more likely for students to be with you, building a secure schema and learning more. So there we go. I mean, that's my evangelical speech about checking for understanding. And it's something which, is something to work on. And you might do that well, but then you might find there are things to work on. So I hope you found that useful. While I'm still on here, I'm going to give you a quick plug for these in action books if you don't know about these. These are from great people like Ollie Lovell. He's on the same time as me right now, I think. And if you don't know about these series, just go and check out the In Action series. They're all short little pamphlets, and they're really a punchy kind of account of how these ideas apply in the classroom, and you might just find them useful to have in your school. Okay, that's me done. Thank you so much.